Well, in recent times, it seems the Australian government has discovered, again, the importance of our place in the region. A few weeks ago, the government released its white paper on Australia in the Asian century. Well, the Asia Link Commission at the University of Melbourne has today released a report titled Our Place in the Asian Century, and it's urging all Australians to broaden the focus beyond China and the US and to take in Southeast Asia. Well, to talk about the report, I'm joined by one of its editors, Professor Tony Milner, who's also Professor of Asian History at the ANU. Tony Milner, thanks very much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Why did you decide this report was needed? Why is it needed now?
Well, the report takes the view that, that we have been neglecting ASEAN quite seriously. I mean, ASEAN's the part of the ASEAN region, the Southeast Asian countries, are the part of Asia closest to us, and yet we've been constantly discussing China, the United States, China, the United States. But when we ask what should Australia do in engaging the Asian region, where should Australia place emphasis, it really makes sense to place emphasis on those Southeast Asian relationships, and on that basis build our relationship more generally in the region. We started this report before the white paper, but in a sense it is a criticism of the white paper. For all its great aspirational qualities, the white paper doesn't focus in this way on a strategy. Before
we look closer at your proposals in regard to ASEAN and the Southeast Asian nations, in the forward, former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans says that we have been overwhelmingly preoccupied with the US and China. Do you agree with that term? Have we been overwhelmingly preoccupied with these two superpowers that mean so much to the shaping of this country?
Well, we're all right to be, it makes sense for the whole world to be very concerned about the relationship between those two powers. It's obviously the huge issue of our time. But in terms of what Australia can do, we're making a mistake by being preoccupied there and not by focusing on our immediate priorities. And those priorities, and I completely agree with him, should be in the Southeast Asian region.
In regard to ASEAN, what do you propose in terms of bringing a closer and meaningful engagement with ASEAN?
Well, we talk a lot about Australian-ASEAN relations, even just for their own sake. Many people, I think, in Australia wouldn't realise that ASEAN as a grouping is our second trading partner. I mean, larger than Japan even, 5 times larger than India. So ASEAN's very important to us. We talk about the need to increase investment in ASEAN. We talk about the fact that we've already got quite a strong history of security relations, police relations, and of course diplomatic relations with ASEAN. But what we're most concerned about is that these are not being properly profiled. And if we did profile these more, if we did present Australia much more as a collaborator with ASEAN, arguing with ASEAN sometimes, fair enough, but a collaborator with those Southeast Asian countries, we would up our clout, up our influence in Beijing and in fact in Washington.
In the report, you warn against simplifying or overlooking at least the complexity of Asia. Yet within ASEAN there's a huge difference among the member states, economically, politically, ideologically, in foreign relations, say comparing from Singapore to Burma. I mean, how challenging is it to deal with something of that complexity?
Look, that's absolutely right, and our argument does not depend on the success or otherwise of the ASEAN regional organisation. There are divisions, and of course China and Chinese influence is playing a role in deepening some of those divisions. I'd still say it's been an enormously successful regional organisation if you look at the last few decades and the lack of conflict in the region, the success with which they brought the communist states into ASEAN, and with which in some ways they've dealt and helped the situation in Myanmar. Of course, the range of countries in the region is enormous. So we're not talking about ASEAN as an organisation so much as the Southeast Asian region. And knowing that region, understanding the complexities you're talking about, that's part of our credentials as a country. Now, I think American policymakers see us like that. If they look at Australia at all, and I think they do, they see it as the strength of Australia. Now, we need to emphasise that strength. We need to make that part of our national narrative.
You mentioned before that the white paper was perhaps lacking in strategy when it came to Southeast Asia. If we are looking at the Asian century, How big a blow was that? How big a pitfall was it if there wasn't some sort of strategic foresight applied to how Australia should engage with these various countries in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN?
Well, I think in fairness, the white paper is there to create a national discussion. It states, it puts Asia, front and centre in Australian thinking about the world. It's an aspirational document. It probably is leaving for the next defence white paper the discussion of more detailed strategies in the region. But it's a real problem that it simply lists a number of countries as important countries to Australia, priorities for Australia, whereas in fact what we're concerned about is how we develop relations with one country and how that might affect relations with another, how we think about an overall plan for our Asian engagement. And when we think like that, despite the important relationships we have, for instance, with Japan, with South Korea, and of course growing with India, it's ASEAN that makes sense as the basis for a wider Asian engagement.
Professor Milner, in terms of domestic politics and issues here, say the asylum seeker issue, how does that impede developing relations along the lines you're talking about with some of those ASEAN countries?
Well, taking that issue, and in fact many others, I think we've got to get into the habit of feeling that we've got to work with our neighbours. We've got to take on board that our neighbours are now getting much stronger. I mean, a few years ago we could talk about our GDP as equaling the whole of ASEAN countries put together. And now, by some counts, the Indonesian GDP has already passed ours. The Philippines is coming up, Malaysia, Thailand. We've got to face the fact that we're dealing with stronger countries in the region, ones we need to give respect to. And when it comes to asylum seekers, for instance, we have just got to work with our neighbours. That's what matters, not abusing our neighbours, and there has been abuse, and I think that's a great mistake.
From your broad perspective, is that how it is perceived in some of these neighbouring countries, that it is amounting to abuse?
Oh yes, they're upset, and that's not a good basis for cooperation.
More broadly, what's the feeling among ASEAN members to having deeper and broader engagement with Australia, and in what form?
Well, the report we've done is based very much on consultations in the region. Not just consultations, but ASEAN policy intellectuals involved in the writing of the report itself. We met and had detailed discussions with them, and met with a lot of stakeholders and senior ASEAN people across the region. We were really struck by how warmly they viewed a closer engagement with Australia. They had some tough talk. They said, for instance, it does you no good to be seen as a deputy sheriff. I don't think that's a just thing to see us as a deputy sheriff, but the label's there.
Deputy sheriff of the US, you mean?
Yeah, that's a potent label and one we need to counter, and they told us that time and again. But nevertheless, they see the advantages of Australia's American alliance. They know that it's going to have a long-term importance to us, but they think that we should be much more engaged with ASEAN. They welcome that, and as they put it, a number of them, it should be much more a part of the Australian national narrative.
In regard to that national narrative, it's one thing to bring about a change in government policy or official priority. How do you bring about a change in business thinking and in the public's priorities and approach?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And of course, the white paper is trying to do that. When the Prime Minister launched that white paper, she was trying to create a national discussion, and I think that's very important. So any criticisms I would have of the white paper and shortcomings I see are much less important than that point, that it is helping to create that national discussion and involve more and more people in that discussion. Now, this is going to be a slow process, of course it is. We are a largely Western nation. We've been on that track for 2 centuries. We've been on that track while America, and before that England, was the major power in the world. We're now coming to a new situation. Australians are going to have to think differently. It's not just, as the white paper suggests, about economic opportunities in Asia. There are serious risks in Asia too. And it's with those risks in mind, just as much as the opportunities, that we emphasise that probably finding our home in the Asian region means finding our relations with, building on our relations with ASEAN.
Professor Tony Milner from AsiaLink and also Asian History Professor at the ANU. Thanks very much for taking time for discussing this with us tonight.
Thank you.